Jonathan Spencer felt quite sure his wife just didn't understand him. There he was, working every hour that God sent just to make the payments on their pretty little house in the suburbs. And all she could say was he was never there, that he never paid her any attention, that he had no idea how hard it was to look after 3 such demanding children. He couldn't help but think that she exaggerated a bit. I mean, when he came home in the evening and looked in upon them, well, as they lay there sleeping in their beds, they seemed like 3 little angels to him. A declaration that would send his wife into a rage, and she'd stamp her foot and insist she wished she'd listened to her mother and never married him at all. And so, Jonathan Spencer began to work longer and longer hours in the office, hoping his wife would be asleep by the time he came home each day. It was on one such evening, as he sat there, looking out the office window at the people passing in the street below, envying every carefree soul their freedom. His eyes fell upon a tramp, a homeless man, who seemed to be wandering around in circles. Poor fool doesn't know how lucky he is. No worries, except how to fill his belly and where to sleep each night. And on a sudden impulse, Jonathan stood up and got 2 coffees from the vending machine in the office, took the elevator down to the ground floor, and ignoring the suspicious look of the security guard, he walked out into the street and up to the homeless man. There you go. Now tell me, my friend, what seems to be the matter?
I've lost it.
You've lost what?
My box. Have you seen it?
Jonathan began to regret his impulse to come down to the street and wished he'd stayed up in his office with the comfort of his spreadsheets. But he'd come this far and decided to humour the man. There, I'm sure we'll find it, whatever this box is you seem to have lost. What's your name, my good man? But from the haunted, lost expression on his face, it was clear he no longer knew. That look, that terrible lost expression, stayed with Jonathan all evening, and so he decided to go home early. As he went down to the garage and found his car, he discovered there was a cardboard box on top. He was going to throw it away, but, well, there was something so good and straightforward about a cardboard box in these tricky modern times. And he decided to throw it on the back seat of the car. Who knows, but he might meet the owner on the way home. He drove home and saw the lights were still on, and as he opened the front door, he said, Do you know, darling, I met the strangest man today. And I married the strangest man, who would rather spend more time with his office than he would with his family. Moments later, Jonathan found himself backing out of the house with the door slammed in his face. Why did you sleep with your computer, as you seem to like it more than me? Jonathan stormed down the sidewalk, furious. But did she think money grew on trees? Who was it paying for the mortgage on their house in the first place? He walked on down to the car, in a mood to drive to a hotel, and maybe rent himself some company for the night, as many of his colleagues did in similar situations. No, he knew, despite everything, he just wasn't the kind of man to make that sort of betrayal. So instead he climbed into the back seat of the car and he found the cardboard box. And he discovered that if he put his head inside it as he lay down, well, then he couldn't see the glaring street lights anymore. And Jonathan slept the sleep of the just. Only awaking next morning at 11 o'clock. Well, there was no time to go and change clothes or take a shower, so he climbed through to the front seat of his car and drove to work at top speed. But he discovered the garage was mostly empty, and the security guard had to inform him that, well, it being a Saturday, nobody else had come to work. Jonathan drove home, well rested from his good sleep, but feeling rather confused. He stopped to buy some flowers for his wife, and he spent the rest of the day trying to be the perfect husband and the model father. But even as he cooked the pasta for the evening meal and he helped his eldest daughter with her homework, he only had one thought on his mind. The box on the back seat of his car. Well, what if someone broke in and stole it, thinking maybe there was something valuable inside? Finally, after he finished doing the washing up, he couldn't stand it anymore, and telling his wife he was going out to buy some milk, he left the house and walked down the sidewalk, hurrying, doing his best not to break into a run, and he only heaved a sigh of relief when he saw the box was still there on the back seat of his car. He climbed in and felt the strangest impulse to pick up the box and put it on his head. Why not? And lifting it up, he placed it down on his head and found instant peace. All his worries, all his troubles, they were far away on the outside. Here was security. Here was comfort. And when he finally took it off, an hour or two later, well, he did feel a bit self-conscious. Weren't those teenagers on the street over there perhaps looking at him? He supposed it did look a bit foolish. A grown man sat in the back of a car with a box on his head. Well, to those who didn't understand. Perhaps he better find a more private place to enjoy himself. Jonathan's wife looked out the kitchen window and smiled as she saw her husband walking towards the garage with a box under his arm. He hadn't been the best father of late, it was true, but at least he didn't forget the most important things. The next day was her youngest son's birthday, and she was glad to see that though he hadn't been the best father lately, at least he hadn't forgotten to buy a present.
What do you mean you forgot?
She screamed at him the next morning.
Have you any idea how important today is to him? You get out there and don't you come back until you have got one for him.
Jonathan found himself backing out of the house for the second time in the last few days with the door slammed in his face. Of course, there was no point trying to explain to her that it was Sunday and all the shops would be closed. He walked off down to the garage, hoping he might find something there that would do as a present. Perhaps an old pair of boxing gloves or a cricket bat. But after a couple of hours of searching around, all he could find was an old, incomplete stamp collection and a broken fishing rod. He briefly thought about giving the box to his son as his birthday present. Well, didn't children sometimes enjoy the packaging more than the actual gift? But he didn't think his son would see it that way, or his wife. He heard his children come awake and run to play in the garden outside. and the sounds of their joyful, carefree voices made him feel like an utter failure. And without quite knowing what he was doing, he felt his hands just reaching over for the box. He picked it up and placed it down on his head. And there he stayed for the whole day. And only when he took it off, he saw it was already dark outside and the garden had gone quiet. He let himself into the house and walked up the stairs, but he didn't have the heart to look in upon his children. And he walked through to the bedroom. The lights were off, but he could tell by the sound of his wife breathing in the darkness that she was still awake. He climbed into bed behind her and he tried to put his arm around her, but she flinched away. "Are you having an affair?" "Come now, Laura. That's the craziest thing." "Laura? Who the hell is Laura?" "I'm Lydia." It was no big surprise to Jonathan when he came home from work the next day that the house was empty. His wife had gone, taking the furniture and the children. There was a note on the kitchen table, but he couldn't think what it might say that would matter anymore. Well, at least now he wouldn't have to hide. He walked on down to the garage, returned with a box, and set it down in the main room. And dropping to his knees, he crawled inside. And there he stayed for a couple of days until he decided perhaps it was time to go to work. And he got in his car and began to drive, but he realized he couldn't remember exactly where it was that he worked, or what it was that he did exactly. He drove around and around in ever increasingly unlikely circles before just giving up and going home. Jonathan didn't go out much after that. The phone rang from time to time, but he couldn't think who it might be or what they might want. He fed himself by going to the kitchen and taking whatever combination of foods he found, which grew ever less appealing. Until one day he was roused out of his box by a thumping on the door. As he answered it, he found two men there, in suits with a clipboard, and they made him sign something. And then they told him that as of now the house belonged to them, and he was free to leave with whatever he could carry. So it was. Jonathan Spencer found himself walking down the path of his garden, in his dressing gown, a pair of slippers, and his box under his arm. He'd sure fooled them. But even now, he could feel everybody's eyes upon his box. No, this wouldn't do at all. He would have to find a good hiding place for it. And so Jonathan Spencer began to hide his box around the town, leaving it only when he had to go to use the toilet in McDonald's or to beg some bread from the bakery. But at last came the day that, returning with a couple of yesterday's loaves, he couldn't remember where it was he'd hidden his box. He checked one hiding place after the other and ran around the town, asking people, had they seen it? Had they seen his box anywhere? Until at last came the day that he couldn't remember what it was he was looking for exactly. And so Jonathan Spencer joined the ranks of those lost souls, that procession of lost beings who walk the streets, looking for something, if only they knew what.